And again, it's just, what's their process? Like, do they know what the requirements are to meet their incentives? And if they don't know, and sometimes it's because someone else has set up the incentive. It wasn't necessarily the tax team that set up the incentive, but somebody has to make sure that you continue to meet it so you get the benefits of it.
This episode is brought to you by Green Skies Analytics, an audit analytics service provider that works with internal audit departments that have data analysts and are still frustrated with trying to make analytics actually work, aren't getting the expected ROI, who can't break through the communication barrier between the analysts and the audit team, and those that need experienced direction for an audit analytics strategy and process. Those that feel like they've wasted time and money on trainings, aren't getting the value they want, not prioritizing the highest risk areas for the organizations, or have projects that seemingly never get completed. Do you deal with any of that? If you do, go to the show notes of this episode and click the Green Skies Analytics link, or go to greenskiesanalytics.com to schedule a call and understand how Green Skies Analytics makes analytics actually work for internal audit. This episode is brought to you by Supervisor. Supervisor is a ready-to-use audit analytics platform that integrates with your ERP and any other systems you have to provide actual continuous monitoring for risk across all your transactions. They have more than 350 out-of-the-box checks and analytics to enable your team to perform full population testing, detect multiple types of anomalies, and identify potential fraudulent activity. That's going to give you an unparalleled level of assurance in your financial processes. Built by internal audit and accounting experts, so your team can get value from the first day of usage. So imagine having no analytics today, walking in tomorrow, and having up to 350 audit analytics already run. You don't have to necessarily take my word for it, though. Global organizations such as IKEA, Michelin, Lacoste, and numerous others trust Supervisor to enhance their audit capabilities and increase their assurance.
This podcast is also brought to you by Audit Board, the leading cloud-based platform transforming how enterprises manage risk. Audit Board's integrated suite of easy-to-use audit, risk, and compliance solutions streamlines internal audit, SOX compliance, risk management, and security compliance. Automate processes and improve execution with Audit Board's purpose-built solution, which is designed to address the most pressing challenges of today's practitioners. Experience the latest in audit, risk, and compliance technology. Visit auditboard.com to schedule your product walkthrough to see Audit Board's award-winning platform in action today.
Hey everybody, before we jump into the show, I just want to let you know that the Audit Analytics and AI Conference is September 25th and 26th this year. It's all virtual, so no matter where you are in the world, you can absolutely attend. Recordings are also available, so if you are 12 hours away and don't want to be up at 3, 4, 5 in the morning, you can purchase the recordings. This is the only conference that's strictly about analytics and AI for internal audit. So you're going to get your practitioners' use cases. This thing is practitioner-led, save for one speaker that we had this year, but everyone else is in your peer group, ranging from the largest internal audit data analytics teams in the world down to the individual contributor who spends, hey, I got 50% of my time I can dedicate towards analytics. Each speaker's mission is to show you how to actually do what they are talking about. So thought leadership is great, and there will certainly be some of that, but for the most part, that's great. We love the thought leadership. Show us how to actually do it. We are currently at 19 speakers and counting, so we're going to add a few more, and you can get up to 19 CPEs if you attend. Check out the link in the show notes, or you can search for Google the auditanalyticsconference.com, and you can register there. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Audit Podcast. I am your host, Trent Russell, and today on the show, we have Michelle Velez. She is the Chief Audit Executive at ITT. ITT is a $3 billion manufacturer of critical engineered components that serve fast-growing end markets in the transportation, flow, energy, aerospace, and defense. You probably saw from the title that we're talking tax. I was absolutely terrified to put tax in the title. I know myself, whenever I see or hear the word tax, I run away from it immediately. Probably, though, similar to how people think when they hear the word audit. And so I could definitely empathize with most people's position there as well. So anyway, Michelle is probably the perfect person for this. We did want to take a deep dive on the tax side because we haven't done that on the show. And it's a, pretty important part of the organizations we work for. tax and their strategies and the like. And so given Michelle's very, very extensive tax background and the fact that in having some conversations with her prior to the recording, I knew she was interesting and could deliver that topic in a way that would not suck, for lack of better terms. It'd be super boring. So we're going to hang out in the tax topic for a while. There is an analytic for that Michelle walks us through. We even pull up the screens and show the specific form that Michelle mentions and how to get that data from your tax team. It's super easy. And so it's a really good, if you have a analytics menu or list of analytics that you like to run, this is a good one to plug in there. We have done that on our site at Green Skies. But then some of the areas that we talk about, so we've had a IT audit director who is a CAE at a financial institution, which is pretty unusual. We've had someone whose background is in geographic information systems, who is now a CAE also. And so now we have someone whose background has been tax their entire career. It was now in this CAE role. So we understand Michelle's journey from tax to CAE, some of the lessons learned. Michelle's in year 2 now. So what happened year 1 that you can learn from, that you could share with the listeners of the show so that they could then learn from. And then again, like I mentioned, how can we audit tax? And then lastly, Michelle's also pretty passionate about efficiencies and how to gain efficiencies, especially in the audit process, obviously now. And so we talked through some examples, some real world examples of what she has done in her brief time at ITT to get those efficiencies gained. Here we go. All right, what is in either or your internet browsing history or your chat GPT history?
So I would say browsing history first would be, I was in a charity soccer tournament this weekend, so did a lot of research on how to get rid of shin splints and how to use that massage gun. Like, what's the right angle to get those shin splints out? And so it's a very effective Google session I had there.
Nice. And for those that struggle with shin splints and don't know what you're talking about, what are you talking about? You're talking about the therapeutic punching gun thing?
It's like a gun, yeah. So it's like, and it's a USB charger, right? So you and there's this fork attachment, and you put the fork attachment in, and then you actually move down from the muscle, and it releases like the pressure in your calf muscle, so that like the front of your shin doesn't hurt to walk.
Okay, we are learn things all the time.
Yeah.
So yeah, we have one of those also. I love it for my back, just to hold it and then stick it right there on the upper back. Feels fantastic after sitting like this. Most of the day. So, okay, excellent. So your background is all tax. Like if people go to your LinkedIn, they're going to see tax.
Yep.
And yeah, tax and audit kind of hang out together a little bit, especially from the outside looking in. People just go CPAs, audit, you're all the same, tax, it's all the same deal. You're the first person that I know of that I've talked to, especially that went from like full on tax to CAE. So I think there's probably some interest from the listeners. What was that journey like? How did you end up as the CAE?
Yeah, I would say I was probably more surprised than anyone, but spending a year, especially how much I love tax, like anyone who knows me knows like I'm tax obsessed. So I think it was the biggest shock for me. I was like, why would I do that? But I think being in the role for almost a year, I really see the benefit to it. I think tax professionals are data driven. We read regulations all the time. We have to know, the accounting consequences. We have to really understand it because the accounting rules serve as the basis for many of the tax rules. And then we know the full business, right? So we don't focus on one segment. When you file a tax return, it's your entire operation, right? And so when we're thinking about, we want to have a dividend, we want to pay a dividend, we will talk to the business and say, like, what are your working capital needs? If there's R&D going on and there's an opportunity to get like a patent box or sort of like any of those innovation incentives that governments are offering, we really want to understand, okay, where are you doing R&D? Where is there innovation going on? And then if companies are thinking about expansion, we want to understand, like, are there government grants available? And so I think as tax professionals, like, we want to capitalize on all those opportunities. And so we need to know the business in order to be in the right position to capitalize on them. And I think that's what is the reason that they thought of me first and said, like, hey, we think you'd be great for this.
Yeah. So there's you as the tax person. And then we also had Katie Rich on recently, and she was GIS.
I listened to her.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
GIS.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And so
I listened to her like last week, I think. Yeah.
Okay. So it's kind of similar. She was like, I don't even know what audit is. I mean, to some degree, I think she had gone through an audit, and that was where some of the interest came from. But I think if I recall correctly, I said, why did they, basically pick you? And she said, I understood the business extremely well. And that is huge for an auditor, is to understand the business to help really make a lot of change. So fantastic. I think we've heard that from a lot of CAEs and just thought leaders in general, audit versus knowing the business. And it's always like, I'd rather have somebody that really knows the business.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, and especially like I think in tax, right, and similar probably to the GIS role, is that you're seeing everything and you're understanding everything. And then sort of where the limitations are, where the risks are, you have a better appreciation for like, what's happening. Like I was really surprised coming into the role, and like taxes, and just for anyone who's listening, like tax is a wealth of information, right? So if you're not sure, if you walk into, a company and you're like, hey, what are our manufacturers? What are our distributors? Ask the tax team. They know who's manufacturing. They know who's selling to related parties. They know where the outbound payments are. They know where the cash is sitting. They know where the assets are sitting. And so I would say like, get a tax person on your guest audit, not to do the tax work, but just because they'll have a full wealth of information. You'll be surprised by how much they know.
Yeah, I think as you're saying this, a couple of things are coming to mind. One, I'm kind of curious now, like day one-ish, if we said it that way, knowing what you know about the business, what did you kind of do differently, or maybe a way to ask it, the first audit you picked, or like the first initiative because of your understanding of the business? What did that look like?
The first thing I did is built a risk assessment. And so, the team didn't necessarily have like a centralized, list of like all the sites and where they're located and what their headcount is, and whether they're a manufacturer, distributor, how long they've been in operation. And so with a lot of the tax information I had, I just sort of built that out and then put in a lot of complex formulas to sort of say, like, as an example, like one issue that we had a T&E issue. And so when I was building out the risk assessment, I said, okay, how much is the average T&E spend by site, by headcount? And so we generally saw it, let's just say $1,000. And then we saw one site and it was $4,000. And we're like, we're auditing them because why are they the outlier? And so it was a lot of that. And then also looking at like where there's been a lot of turnover, is that a function of like, where did their controls end up? And a lot of what we saw was where controls were failing, it was because there'd been transition, whether someone got promoted or someone left. And so then what we started doing proactively is we worked with HR to build like this like headcount file. And so every month I get an email that tells me who in finance has left. And then I proactively reach out to the GMs or the business leaders at that site. And, obviously they probably already know, and they're thinking about all the business impacts, but I'm there to remind them like, hey, we've generally seen control failures where there's turnover. So we want you to be aware of that. We don't want you to lose sight of that. Versus coming in at the back end and saying, hey, we're going to audit you. Oh, you had turnover. We're going to have some findings. Like, I like to proactively talk to them. And I think that helps because it gets them thinking about it.
Yeah. I would say turnover rate is probably one of the best predictors of control failure.
Yes,
and especially
100%.
For people that have the resources to be able to have effectively a dashboard that goes like, hey, this is what your AP looks like. This is what HR, your turnover looks like. This is what T&E looks like for any given, division, branch, cost center, whatever it is, or just the departments in general, is a really, really good tool to have when folks can be able to do that. And it sounds like you're leveraging and building stuff along those lines. I'm curious, from year one CAE to year two CAE, largely, I guess, kind of think about it from the perspective of people that are aspiring to be a CAE or literally in the exact same situation. Like, okay, I'm coming into year two now. Lessons learned from that. What could you share with other CAEs or aspiring CAEs?
I would say I'm going to sound like a broken record because I feel like you hear it at all the conferences, but getting in touch with the business, like, don't audit from your desk, right? Like, when you have downtime, like reaching out, having those conversations, consistently networking with your peers, because they're not just networking, right? But going to them and saying like, hey, what are you struggling with? Like, what are you seeing? Like, and also sharing with them what you're seeing. So like, I'll give you an example. Like, I was at a conference recently, and one of the presenters had talked about Amazon fraud. And so, and how, prevalent that was in their organization, and just sort of letting the rest of us know. And so I came back from that conference, did a search of all of our Amazon spend by business unit, and then sent it out to all the business leaders and said, hey, this is something that we're hearing, that there's fraud involved with, Amazon. Because again, you can buy anything on Amazon. You can buy bearings, or you can buy potatoes, or you can buy, brand new shoes, or, it's hard to know the difference, right? And so as a manager who's reviewing a report and sees an Amazon spend, how in the details are you looking at that? And so it was sort of one, when you see Amazon, so your intent is to go up and say, hey, wait a minute, let me take another step at this. Let me look at it and just make sure it's right. And so I think that was really helpful. But then also making sure, Amazon has, you've got your Amazon spend on your T&E card, but then if you've got an Amazon business account, and so where there's an Amazon business account, there's a lot more controls that can be put in place versus the T&E, right? So some of the examples that we had seen at this conference was an individual that was editing the Amazon receipt, right? And so if someone's editing an Amazon receipt, you don't have access to their Prime account.
Yeah.
How are you going to go back to it? Versus if you're on the Amazon business, the company's got that access. And so I think that was a huge thing to sort of bring up. And then supply chain was Michelle, tell us who it is. We're in. We will reach out to them. We will get them on Amazon Business because that's what we want to see anyways. And so it's just knowing sometimes what you want, someone else wants as well, and making those connections to understand who wants what. And then, reducing obviously the risk for the company, which is the most important thing.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. I think a lot of people do this, especially within the internal audit department itself, but maybe not. I don't hear about it as much, sending it out broader. But yeah, if you go to a conference and you learn stuff, usually it's we'll send one person, you go learn everything, you come back and you tell us what you learned, which kind of hit or miss depending on, how you have that structured. But certainly if you sent that out to business, think of it almost as if you send out a weekly newsletter, except try to make it good and valuable and not just something to pump out every week. I think a way to think about it. Well, I think I know why there's probably not the great relationships from audit and literally everyone else in the business and tax. And that's, for me, tax is pretty intimidating. Even when I was in external audit and there was IT audit team, the core assurance, CPA, business audit side, and then there's tax. And I was hey, CPA folks, I can talk to you. We're cool, everything. I'd have to go talk to the tax people. And I was I have no idea what you're talking about. I'm just going to throw my hands up already. You know what I do to some degree. Can you just kind of help me figure it out? So I think tax is intimidating and has this horrible perception, probably even maybe worse than audit, just because everybody hates tax time. Nobody, well, you might get excited about it. But nobody enjoys tax time. So I think what we would like to do is demystify that to some degree, and I'll give you have the floor. You just go, you run with it. Tell us how to. I also don't see a lot of tax audits on audit plans. So represent your tax people, make them not look terrible, and walk us through how you would audit tax. And you have as much time as you need, because again, we haven't taken I think this is the first time we've even talked about this topic. So I want to go pretty deep on this one compared to what we usually do. So floor is yours. You go.
Okay. So I would say before you even think about auditing tax is do you understand the operations? And the best place to understand the operations from a tax perspective is country by country reporting. So it's this form. If you're a U.S. multinational company, you file it with the IRS. It's called a Form 8975. But if you're in any other country, again, this is most multinationals that are, making more than $750 million in revenue are going to be required to file it with their local country. And then it gets shared globally. Yep. So it's not publicly available, but it's going to be shared with the tax authorities. And so I say that's your starting point. And the reason it's your starting point is because it starts with what countries are you operating in? What's your head count? What's your revenue? What's your intercompany, so related party revenue? What's your cash paid in taxes versus what's your current year accrual? And it just a wealth of information. Oh, and then also another important, you have to say what your primary business is, right? So if you are, there's these codes you use, right? But it'll say you're either a manufacturer, you're a distributor. So you start with that point. And then if you think about it just from, let's just pretend you're, a U.S. multinational company and you have operations in Europe. Right? So you'd say, okay, well, what's my biggest European site? Well, it depends on what you think of as big. Is it revenue?
Yeah.
and how do they make their revenue? So if you look at this form, you might see that they have millions of dollars in tangible assets, but 4 people. And you'd say, well, how are they making, why do they have all these assets? And why do they have all this revenue and only 4 people? And it might be that they're manufacturing, they have like a fully autonomized manufacturing facility. But so where you see a site that doesn't have a lot of tangible assets and they've got a lot of revenue, you'd say, well, how are they generating the revenue? And it's through intangibles, right? Whether it's patents that they're licensing out or what have you. So, and it just gives you a really good sense of like, what are they doing at that site and does that make sense? Now, if you look at a site that has a ton of intercompany revenue and no people and no assets, you might kind of say like, what's going on there? Yep. And so maybe you as the internal auditor just want to understand it. And so I would say that's your first step in understanding tax is like, why is there so much revenue? Or as an example, you could see a site that has a ton of revenue and no tax. And you'd say, why isn't there any tax there? And I think that's where when you say like, how do I audit tax? Look at that form first, and then look where you're paying the most tax. And where you're paying the most tax doesn't make sense. Now, if you've got a site that is operating in a country that has a really beneficial tax regime, maybe there's some type of incentive, it's going to pop on that form because you're generally going to expect most countries are going to be paying tax of at least 15 to 20%. If you see a tax rate in one of those countries that's below that rate, there's an incentive going on. And so then you ask yourself, like, are we doing everything we can to meet the requirements of our incentives? A lot of times incentives will come with a minimum hiring requirement, right? Like we'll give you $2 million, but you need to make sure that you have, 10,000 people employed in this operation for the next 5 years, right? And so that's where I think understanding tax is important. And again, it's just, what's their process? Like, do they know what the requirements are to meet their incentives? And if they don't know, and sometimes it's because someone else has set up the incentive. It wasn't necessarily the tax team that set up the incentive, but somebody has to make sure that you continue to meet it so you get the benefits of it. So I would say that's probably the starting point. And then obviously, if you're looking at, your tax footnote, that goes through the effective tax rate, and then you can see sort of what are the main drivers of, your tax expense. And again, you can dive in from there. But I would say there's nothing better than country by country reporting for really understanding the tax landscape of your company.
Yeah, well, I'm definitely not going to fire my CPA after that lesson, but that was good stuff to know. All right, so for those that are listening to the audio on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you're listening to this, we just went ahead and pulled up Form 8975, Schedule A, so that Michelle can basically just point us out and go, hey, look at this thing, look at this thing, look at this thing, so that, there is not a single form tax-related that when I look at it, I go, yeah, this is super clear, and I understand exactly what's going on. So the screen is shared. If you're listening, if you want to jump to the YouTube version of the show, my screen is shared. Michelle can see it, and she's going to walk us through how to kind of take a peek at this thing and understand the business a little bit better.
All right. So your part 1, where it says like tax jurisdiction information, that's going to be the country. So let's pretend that you're in Canada. It's going to say Canada. And then if you go down to unrelated revenue, so the first one, that's unrelated party revenue. So that's revenue that you make from third parties. The next column is your related party revenue. So that's all intercompany transactions. And then you have your total. So when you're looking at Canada, you can easily see, okay, how much is my related versus unrelated? Next column is profit before income tax. So that's a good indicator. The next column is income tax paid on a cash basis, which is really unique, right? It's basically saying how much cash went out the door to pay tax. And then the next column is your income tax accrued. So that's your current year accrual of tax. And then the next few columns, stated capital, fine, accumulated earnings, fine. The more important one is number of employees. So remember how I was saying earlier, if you don't have a lot of employees, but you've got a ton of revenue, you'd say like, where's this revenue coming from? So this is a helpful metric. And then the last one is your tangible assets other than cash and cash equivalents. And so where I think about this is tangible assets are going to be really high for a manufacturer. So if you had this, and your tax team has to populate this form. So they have this information, which means they probably have it in Excel. So I would ask for the Excel version of it. And then you can filter and see, okay, I can see all my entities on one page. I can see who's got the tangible assets. I can see who's got the number of employees. And then you can run a bunch of metrics on this. So as I was saying earlier, if you don't have a lot of employees, but you've got a ton of assets, maybe it's manufacturing facility that's got, completely built on machines, or if you've got a lot of revenue but not a lot of tangible assets, you'd say, okay, maybe I'm making my revenue from intangible assets like patents or trademarks or what have you. So no, I think this is a really good a good place to start, again, to understand your operations and then to understand where you need to dive in. And there's no effective tax rate in here, but you can easily get that, right? If you just take your income tax accrual, which is number 4, and you divided it by your number 2, then you'd easily come up with a rate and you'd be able to see. And then you'd also be able to see like what percentage of my revenue is attributable to my employees versus my tangible assets, right? So there's a lot you could do with it.
And that data request, is that just who would you hit up for that and go, hey, can I get Form 8975 Schedule A? If you have it in Excel, could you send that to me? Who are we looking to get that from? Just anybody in tax?
Your tax team. I mean, the VP of tax certainly is going to know that. And I think it's especially important, that form, as we come to Pillar 2. So Pillar 2 is the most recent, as I mentioned earlier, right, tax rules change all the time. And so the most recent change and probably the most sweeping reform that we've seen is this Pillar 2, which is a global minimum tax. And so this global minimum tax came into effect January 1st. And so we call it like the safe harbor. And I always remind people, like, you don't want to get crushed by a wave. You want to stay safe in the harbor. Like, you don't want to be out in those 100-foot waves out in Portugal. But the way that you stay safe is that form that we just went through, the country by country reporting form. If you have a qualified CBCR and you're paying more than a 15% tax rate in all of those jurisdictions, then you're probably not going to have a global minimum tax, which is the Pillar 2 global minimum tax. But if you see jurisdictions that are below that 15%, then the question you should ask your tax team is, are we paying a global minimum tax in this country?
I bet if especially the IT auditor or something like that goes in and asks the tax person, like, what the hell? Where did that come from? Like, how did you know to ask that question? I got to be honest, even, we've talked a handful of times before this, and I go, Michelle's cool, great personality, all that kind of good stuff. I was just like, I don't really know if I want to talk about this tax thing, though. And I think you did a really good job. Like, I was genuinely interested in what you're talking about. So thank you very much for that. I'm sure the listeners appreciate it also. Probably one that we're going to have to go back to, and the listeners would have to, like, if you're not listening to this in front of your laptop where you can take notes or something, highly recommend doing that. So make note of the timestamp on the episode and go back and listen to it so you can, because there's a lot of good stuff in there that people need to know. Okay. So aside from tax, I know you are especially passionate about efficiencies. So I just want to see, to the degree you could, any examples that you can share, any that had maybe 1 or 2 that had the highest ROI that you could share with the listeners.
Yeah, sure. So one thing that we started this year that has been super enlightening is we did this, we call it like a key controls audit. So normally we do a SOX audit, there's 30 controls, we go out to the site, we test all the controls, we come home, it's a good, week, 2 weeks worth of work. What we found, what we started doing this year is we said, we're just going to look at 3 controls, but we're just going to look at those 3. And then depending upon, it would allow us to cover more of the companies. And then more importantly, like when you dive in and you're still doing the walkthrough, we're not going to the site, but we're doing the walkthrough, we're asking the questions, we're getting the documentation. And then where we see that, like, hey, this doesn't seem like a really strong control environment, that we know we have to dive in a little bit deeper. And where we see really robust controls and really strong execution, we say, you know what, if we went in and audited the other, 27 controls, we probably aren't going to find much. And obviously for our significant sites, we have to do that. But for the ones where we're rotating through, we did find just reviewing key controls has been really helpful. Like I said, it's a good glimpse of the control environment. It's not a full, but it's a good glimpse.
I think that's something that people get caught up in a little too much. And I know the saying was always, especially when it came to stocks, like, don't just do it because if we ever answered the question, why'd you do that? Because we did it last year, that was immediately like, just don't say anything if that's going to be your answer. And I feel like there's probably not enough people that, and maybe, you coming in almost from the outside and going like, this is kind of dumb. Like, why are we doing it like that? Dumb's probably a strong word, but like, why are we doing it like this? What if we did this approach? And so I think we should sit down almost from an outside perspective and go, why are we doing this way now? I don't know if enough people do that. So, okay. Anyway, enough of my rant. Do you have another example you're going to share?
Yeah. The other one I think that was helpful is we started sending out like a questionnaire. And, I know people are like, oh, you don't get a lot of information from surveys, or questionnaires, but what you do get is that people are generally honest, right? Because they don't know that you're asking them a question, especially if it's worded correctly, right? Like, do you have access to open and closed periods? Yes or no? Do you have access to post-journal entries? Yes or no? Well, if you answered yes to both of those questions, then we have a segregation of duties issue. And a lot of times people don't realize that they have a segregation of duties issue. And so it's just sending out those questions and coming back. Now, could I have, spent, a ton of money on a GCC audit? Absolutely. But sometimes the user is just going to tell me that they have access that they shouldn't have, because they don't know that they're not supposed to have that. So I do find that questionnaires are really helpful for just getting a lay of the land, especially for sites like if it's not material enough for us to audit, but we just want to understand like what's happening. I found that the questionnaires are really helpful. And we found a few issues that we were able to we sent out the questionnaires, we got back the responses, and then before Q1, we had them correct those issues quickly. We were like, yeah, that's not okay. Fix that. So it is very helpful.
All right. For those that listen to the show, they know that I love practical advice, how to actually do something, and especially with this tax thing that, even coming into this, I was a little surprised, like, all right, we're going to do the tax thing. Today is the tax episode. So I absolutely loved it. I'm not joking at all. I'm not trying to blow smoke up anything. I thought it was really great and really helpful. And I guess my ask right now would be not necessarily you, but the listeners. If you take what Michelle said and apply it, please reach out and let me know, because I am very interested in this. With all that said, though, thank you a ton, Michelle, for coming on. What do you want to leave the audience with?
I would say stay curious. So my grandfather was a police officer, and he asked a ton of questions. And he would always say, you ultimately, when you find an answer that's convenient, you want to move on. But that's not always the right answer. And so stay curious, keep asking. If someone can't explain what they do or why they do it, it's probably an indication that they don't know it as well as they think they do, or you're talking to the wrong person. So don't let people fluff you. I think I've seen it, I've seen it a lot. And I think the more you ask, the more solid the responses will get, or they won't. And then you have a problem. So anytime I haven't asked the right question, or I haven't dug deeper when I had that little suspicion, it's always come back to bite me. So don't settle.
Hey everyone, thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Audit Podcast. Whatever platform you're listening on right now, I'm sure there's a subscribe button somewhere, so please hit the subscribe button there. If you're listening through iTunes or Spotify, feel free to go give us that 5-star rating. It only took me about 16 seconds to give myself a 5-star review, and it really helps to get future guests to come on the show, so we'd really appreciate that. Lastly, be sure to check out the show notes and follow us on all our social media channels, on Instagram, on LinkedIn, and on TikTok. Also, if interested, please sign up for our weekly newsletter from the Audit Podcast. Thank you all. Have a great one.